to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, a serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs, and currently I'm teaching entrepreneurship at Vinh University in Hanoi, Vietnam. Today's guest is Dr. John Hillen, author of the book The Strategy Dialogues, a primer on business strategy and strategic management. John, welcome.
Good to be with you, Mark.
Well, first, I'd like to start with you telling us how you got to where you're at right now professionally. So just give us the short story about your professional career.
So I'm on my fourth career at the tender age of 59. And I started off as a soldier, and then I migrated from there to be a policymaker, and from there into being a business leader, and finally an academic. And what ties that weird journey together is all along the way in those different kinds of institutions, I was always interested in two things. One was the strategic aspect of them. Where's this institution going? What are we doing today, and how does it contribute to something bigger than what we're working on right now? And I was always interested in the leadership aspects of them. How do we mobilize and inspire people to work together to accomplish whatever we're working on? And so those kind of things were constant themes and allowed me to move from being, a combat soldier to being an assistant secretary of state to being a public company CEO to now, being a board director and a board chairman and an academic.
You've certainly had a great career. What was your role in the military? And thank you for your service.
Yeah, thanks. So I was a cavalry officer, and as you can imagine, sort of from the old movies, it has the same mission. We just don't use horses anymore, but you run out in front of the main ground forces and scout and try to figure out where the adversary might be and what their disposition is, if you will, and then come back with that information and help the main forces engage in the best way possible. So for me, that really came out in two episodes. I was on the border between the two Germanys the night the wall fell. So that was a pretty interesting episode. And the very end of the Cold War as a young lieutenant. I had a young captain with me named H.R. McMaster, South Philly boy, who went on to become a three-star general and the national security advisor. And then HR and I were together again in Operation Desert Storm in the middle of a big tank battle there that we got involved in. I was fortunate. I had some pretty salutary experiences for just a couple of years in the military.
What did you learn from the military in terms about strategy? What did they teach you that you felt that was really worthwhile learning?
Well, the army that I went into in the mid 1980s had to rebuild itself after the low point of post Vietnam. And they rebuilt themselves in a very strategic way. First, they started with how are wars going to be fought in the future and not how they were fought in Vietnam. And then they said, if that's the way wars will be fought in the future, what would be the winning strategy for the US? And the notional adversary always was the Soviet Union at the time, as you remember, in the Cold War. And then they said, well, okay, if that would be our winning strategy, what kind of people would we need to do that? What kind of equipment would we need? How would we all need to talk to each other? What would the plays look like on the field once we ran them? So they started rebuilding it, not unlike the way a GM might build a football team or a basketball team, and I started thinking that way. And then I got to go to war with that army designed by the rebuilders of the 1980s. I got to go to war with that in the 90s, and it was largely a tribute to our success to that. All the pieces fit, and they knew where they were going strategically. So I think that was a real lesson. The other thing is, Mark, we learn a lot from things that don't happen in life. As I'm sitting up in Iraq in April of 1991, the war's over. We've told the Shiite Iraqis to rebel, but we're not going to give them any help. And we concluded a peace deal with Saddam Hussein and let him keep his stuff. So we're watching him beat down with the stuff we let him keep, a revolution we inspire. And I
Yeah.
thought to myself, as a 25-year-old lieutenant, I thought, who thought this through? Like, this is silly. Who thought this through? Like, who's thinking through the big picture? And so I remained interested in strategy because sometimes I saw what it was like when it can really work, and sometimes I saw what a bad situation you could be in when you don't put it all together.
And that's why you learn maybe more for the bad than you do from the good, right?
I think so. I think that's always the case in life.
In chapter one, the concept of strategy is clarified as more than just goals or tactics. How would you advise companies to ensure that their strategy is not only distinct, but also sustainable over time, especially in rapidly changing markets?
Yeah, it's really important, I think, for companies, and I sometimes get pushback from small entrepreneurial companies. They say, "Well, strategy, that sounds like a big company thing. Like IBM needs a strategy. Why do we? We're all working around here in this small business, right? We have stuff to do." And I'll say, "Okay, yeah," because I wouldn't want to ever be prepared for the future. I just want it to happen to me like the weather, right? I'm not going to check the weather. I'm not going to be prepared. I'm not going to do anything. I said everybody needs to think strategically. And I think one of the things that, as you just pointed out, is you got to know what it is. It's not a goal, although goals are part of it. It's not a vision, although a vision can inform your strategy. It's not a mission, even. It's not a values. It is a complete game plan to move an organization from where it is now to a potential better future. Why is that future better? Because if you can move to that place in the market, you have some kind of advantage, a competitive advantage, and hopefully you can sustain it. And then there's a lot of ways to get there, but that's your strategic journey is what are the connected series of moves you'll make to move your organization to a position of better advantage for the future. That whole process, that blueprint, that game plan, that's your complete strategy. And it requires understanding the world you're in. So you understand what movement even means, what does better even mean? And it requires understanding the things you have at your disposal, what kind of organization you are, so you understand how to make the journey and who needs to do what along the way.
Yeah, I teach that in my classes too.
Mm, mm.
And a student often misunderstand tactics for strategy. They always talk about those things, but not really understanding who you're gearing, who are you actually talking to, and what do they want to hear you say. The dialogue emphasizes the importance of organizational purpose at the center of strategy. How can leaders effectively integrate this sense of purpose into their strategy without losing focus on the practical and tactical aspects necessary for a competitive advantage?
So I think one of the most important things leaders can do, and they need to do it periodically, not just once, and not simply at like the big annual offsite. Strategy needs to be part of everyday hygiene, not just conducted at some secretive offsite once a year, which is the way most organizations treat it, frankly. And part of that strategy is like, why are we here? What's our purpose? These seems like trite, almost simple questions, almost insulting to organizations. What's your purpose? But purpose is captured in a lot of things. It's captured in the scope of your activities, your own sense of what your competitive advantage is, your customer sense of why they pick you, what your competitive advantage is, the things you hope to accomplish, the ways in which you operate. This basket of things really captures a sense of purpose. Even your values, like how do we behave around here? All this is captured in purpose. And organizations turn out to be pretty unique. I have a couple of frameworks in the book, and one of them just says, look, there's basically only five dominant genes in any one company's DNA. You're either an innovator, which is you make stuff and it's different than everybody else. You make differentiated product. I'll be like an Apple, right? Their stuff's genuinely different than most other companies. Or you're just super efficient, so you can charge lower prices or deliver some amazing outcome, and that would be like an Amazon, a Walmart, a FedEx. Right? The dominant gene in your DNA is operational efficiency. Your life is time, budget, schedule, right? And you're ruthless about that. Whereas, the innovator's life is design, innovation, experimentation, failure, that kind of thing. Another dominant gene in a company's DNA might be customer affinity. Right? We're just going to wrap ourselves around the customer and do what they say. That really drives us a little bit. So everybody needs to figure out like who they really are, what their core competencies are, and the dominant gene in the DNA. And then that's the foundation from which to move and express your purpose in the future. And I see a lot of companies kind of lie to themselves that way, right? I was working with a big management consulting firm, and they said we want to look more like a technology solutions provider, not a stodgy old management consulting firm. But they were afraid to experiment and afraid to fail. And I said, well, you're not going to be very good at technology solutions if you're always afraid to make the customer uncomfortable or angry. Um, so you need to decide, you know, if what you want to be fits who you actually are.
What would you advise McKinsey and Bain and Company and BCG now that AI has really changed their world in a dramatic way?
Mm,
They're letting folks go because companies are saying, I don't need armies of young people out of undergrad or graduate school
mm,
to do the research when I can go hire virtual assistants in the Philippines for $10 an hour to do exactly what I'm paying your folks $500 per person per
mm.
hour to do. What should they be thinking now as their strategy? Because people are really just interested in the experts, senior partner experts. How are they going to manage this enormous change in their business? And what do you advise them for a strategy?
Yeah, it's a great point because the potential, or I like how the British say it, the potentiality of AI
Yeah.
is so upon us. And what AI will replace is the intelligent processing part of our brain. It's your left brain, right? Your math and science brain is your ability to process a lot of data intelligently, organize it, sort it. Yeah, and AI will be better than your brain at it. So if you're a big strategy consulting company and part of your value proposition is not only telling people the direction they might want to go in the future, but then sorting out all the data and processes and steps and business process improvement and total quality management and Lean Six Sigma and all that stuff, all the process oriented stuff, that's likely going to be done and maybe even done better with the help of AI tools, machine learning tools. What AI tools are less likely to replace is the discernment and the wisdom of putting that first question together. Where should this organization be in the future? Because that requires a set of intelligent bets on the ambiguity of an uncertain future, on the contingency of how events affect each other. And that's judgment, not smarts. That's wisdom, not acumen. I like to say in the Book of Kings, Solomon's having trouble handling his people. And God says, okay, I get it. You got a tough job, Solly. I'm going to give you one gift to help you. And Solomon doesn't ask to be the smartest guy. He doesn't ask to be the strongest guy. He asks for wisdom. Give me a wise and discerning heart. So I think that is the part of a strategy world that won't be replaced because that requires a way to think, not a what to think. And that's a mindset and that ultimately allow you to take intelligent bets about where you want to go in the future.
At I'm here in Hanoi, Vietnam, teaching entrepreneurship at Vin University. And I got invited to the Netherlands ambassador's house for a party the other day. And there were a bunch of ambassadors that were there from other countries. And knowing I'm from the US and knowing I teach at the university, they asked me, what do you think is President Trump's strategy here and the tariffs? And so, without getting political at all,
Mm.
um, how could he better explain his strategy, whether it's right or wrong, and not looking at just the issues in just 2 weeks or a month, but it's got to be a long-term thought out strategy. What would you be advising him if he's going to go down this route about how to think about this and convey it to the world at large? Because the world's totally affected by this.
Yeah, it's a great question, and you put your finger, Mark, on one of the characteristics of true strategy. It's long term. right? So strategy is long term, not short term. It's big picture, not just the world right in front of you. Um, and most importantly of all, strategy links ends and means. It links the objectives with the way you're going to get there. So I think what's confusing about where the administration has been with tariffs is nobody's quite sure which goal they're satisfying and if the means chosen to get them there deliberate. So if the goal is revenue, to raise revenue from tariffs in order to perhaps replace income tax income, then you would put high tariffs into place in the most lucrative areas and leave them there forever. You wouldn't renegotiate them because you have a revenue goal, and the means to get them would be to find the best tariff regimes that would deliver revenue. And that would be a very precise thing. And it would look maybe random in some other respects, but it would be a revenue driver. On the other hand, if your goal is restricting certain um, imports into the US in order to protect and encourage the growth of American industries in those fields, then you would put super high tariffs on certain kind of things. Then this is classic protectionism. The U.S. used it a century ago. Even President Reagan, played a free trader, played with it a little bit to protect certain American industries, but it's very targeted. And you don't negotiate, you don't renegotiate those because they need to be in place. If you want to encourage certain kinds of American industries to reinvest and build factory, that's a 10-year process, right? So you would keep those tariffs in place and they'd be very precise and very targeted, and they'd be intended to produce the outcome of reinvigorating American industry, reshoring certain industries and all the rest. But if your goal is simply renegotiation, you know, then you throw all kinds of things out there, including threats, simply to force people to the bargaining table. And that's increasingly what it looks like to a lot of people is the purpose of all this. So three totally different goals, and you would have three totally different means to deliver them. But the fact that it's all over the map, I think, has people, even people who are in support of it, confused about. I don't understand the linkage between the method chosen and the objectives to be delivered. We seem to be falling back on the objective as we just want to get people to renegotiate. So it's just all to force people to into a conversation we want to have. Well, if that's the case, then the revenue and restriction goals are off the table, or maybe they come back later. There's where I'll end it. No matter how all that fits or does not fit together, one thing a strategist never tries to do is to put themselves at a place of competitive disadvantage along the journey. You always want to end the strategy journey in a place of more advantage. And I think the loss in stock market value, the sliding of treasuries and bonds, and then the weakening of the dollar, let alone international confidence in the U.S. and its strategic sagacity, all seem to say we're putting ourselves in a worse place on whatever strategic journey we're on, not a better place. So I don't think a strategy professor would grade the early parts of this effort very highly, no matter how you feel about the issue itself.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The strategy isn't clear and it's kind of all over the place. So, how can leaders balance the need for a clear and focused strategy with the flexibility to adapt unforeseen challenges or changes in the market, as exemplified by, and you talk about this, the IKEA strategy and its founder's approach?
Yeah, well, I often get this question about timing and flexibility. Should I have a 5-year strategy or should I have a 5-month strategy? And my answer is always the only answer in strategy is it depends. What does it depend on? It depends on how fast the circumstances that affect your business and your world are changing around you. Um, the calendar doesn't cooperate with life's events. So I'm always mystified when I get calls in September and people say, "Can you come help us with our strategy offsite?" And I say, "Oh, why are you doing it this year?" "Well, because we always do it in October." I say, "Oh, that's fantastic. You guys have figured out how to tame the world so that it fits your calendar." Um, People should refresh and relook at their strategy whenever some fundamental dynamic changes, some piece of the external environment. Maybe it's economic, maybe it's political, maybe it's technological, maybe it's legal, environmental, maybe it's in their supplier base, changing their customer habits, changing the competitive environment, something that really affects. You need to refresh. If it's a quick huddle and a quick pivot, you refresh your strategy. So I think that's really important about IKEA. One of the things about IKEA is their strategy was pretty flexible, even though there was always a North Star for Ingvar Kamprad, the founder of IKEA. And the North Star was to democratize the furniture buying experience as he knew it in Europe in the 1950s and 60s, which was slow and expensive and not accessible. And he wanted to change all that. So he's always a North Star, but he never had a policy manual. He never had a management playbook. When he opened his stores, he just told the managers, you know my values, and you read my autobiography, Testament of a Furniture Dealer, his book was called. And it just talked about his view of the world and almost like a religious text. He said, just take the book. You know what we stand for at IKEA, and open up your store in Germany and Poland and France and England and Canada, ultimately the US. Right. And so that gave him a combination of the certitude of a strategic direction and a vision, but also the flexibility for local markets to respond to local events in the implementation.
You're still doing consulting with companies?
I do, yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah. If it's
And
interesting and I think I can help.
yeah, and so what do you advise him? Because I'm sure there's a knee-jerk reaction to what's going on in the short term here, and we need to make adjustments. Do you tell them that they should stay the course, or like you're just saying, hey, there has to be some significant strategic changes based on these new policies, and here's what you have to be thinking about. So what are you advising clients in terms of, do they just stay the course on what they're doing, or do they have to rethink their whole strategy, and how should they look at it?
Yeah. Well, the perfect answer for this is it depends. Right. And so it's different for everybody. Um, However, the more turbulent the times, the more flexible an organization be. Flexible in its strategy, which is, the journey it's on to a better future and the way it's going to conduct that, but not flexible in its purpose. So core values, core purpose, core vision should likely not change, right? That's what your organization was put on the earth to do, so to speak. um, and those things. But the way in which you accomplish that should absolutely change. Now, if you have a certain competitive advantage or certain core competency that is valuable and rare and difficult to imitate and hard to substitute for, that's very hard to pivot away from. I think here, the real secret sauce of Whole Foods is their fresh produce supply chain, which is which is proprietary and brilliant, right? Right on up through owning their own lobster and fishing boats. Um, and when you track where the vast majority of Whole Foods profits come from, it's from the small number of SKUs that they sell, the small number of products in their stores that are fresh produce, right? All the other stuff they don't make that much money on. So that's what they're good at. That's their thing. So, and that took years to build and hundreds of millions of dollars to invest in. It's very hard to pivot away from something like that. So there's some stuff you're always stuck with, but the way in which you express it, the way in which you do it, I think absolutely needs to be, leaders need to be open to refreshing it based upon changing dynamics around them.
Yeah. In chapter 2, the chapter mentions that strategic frameworks are the lenses that help us see things differently. Can you provide a specific example of a strategic framework and illustrate how it could be applied to the real world business scenario to reveal insights that might not be apparent otherwise?
Yeah, sure. So I'll give you two. So frameworks don't provide a ready answer. It's not like finance or accounting or operations management or engineering where you put in the right data and everybody in the room should get the exact same answer. Strategists use frameworks simply to organize their thinking, and that may give them some insights, which may then let them develop some courses of action, which then they can weigh the pros and cons of those and ultimately make a decision. And all the decisions may be different. So there's no right answer in strategy. There's only the soundness of the process you use to get to the answer you chose. But we use frameworks to organize our thinking. So everybody's heard of the SWOT: strengths,
Yeah.
weaknesses, operations, and threats. But the SWOT is a sort of report card on things, the opportunities and threats in your market, and then your strengths and weaknesses as an organization. But I like to turn SWOT on its side and use it as a different framework, TOES, where you line up, and I have this diagram in the book, you line up the threats and opportunities you've discovered from your external analysis, you line them up directly against your strengths and weaknesses, and it gives you different strategic paths to go on. Maybe you're going to use your strengths to exploit a weakness, or maybe you're going to mitigate your weaknesses to protect yourself against a threat. These are different strategic moves. I'll give you an example. Disney bought Pixar for over $7.5 billion, in 2006 or so. Not just because Pixar was better than them at making animated movies, but because if they didn't, somebody else might have. Universal, Fox, Sony, right? And so Disney had this weakness at the time, which is they had lost their mojo. They invented animated movies. By 2006, they had lost their mojo. Nobody watched Disney animated movies. Everybody's watching Pixar or DreamWorks movies, Toy Story, Shrek, all those great, great movies. So Disney had a weakness, uh, and Pixar in somebody else's hands was a threat. So they paid $7.6 billion to uh, to align a strategy that was essentially their weakness against a threat. And so the TOES framework leads you into action. It orients you towards action rather than the SWOT simply being a report card. The other one I think people should know about is most businesses, when you dig down, are a bunch of different businesses inside. And I love the old BCG matrix, which allows somebody to see different businesses they're in and organize their portfolio of businesses and recognize which ones are they have strong market share, and which ones they might have weak market share, and which ones they're in a growth market versus which ones they're not. And it allows people to see, and then they could say, oh gosh, I should divest that. I should reinvest in that. I should just milk that as a cash cow. I need to probe a little bit on that one. It allows people to organize their thinking around the different businesses that are in their one business.
Always curious about why companies that have big leads lose them. So, as an example, Blockbuster had an
Mm,
enormous lead in terms of its brand image and everything else. And when they had the opportunity to buy Netflix, knowing how the internet was growing, and I imagine Netflix making the offer to buy them for wanting to be sold for 50 million is because the dot-com bubble had just burst, money was hard to raise, and so
hmm
they felt this was the way out. And I found out from one of my students who did a report on this, I did not know, which was that Blockbuster was making $1 billion a year in late fees. That was a huge cash cow for
hmm
them. And so if
mm.
they went the route of Netflix, those late fees would disappear, and there goes $1 billion. What would you have advised them on a strategy, considering that the internet was going to change everything for them? Because it
Right.
seems like they were thinking very short term and not looking at the future.
Yeah, that's right. And the thing that put the stake in the heart of Blockbuster was not Netflix, the streaming entity, yet, although that really did, put the final nail in the coffin. But the thing that really doomed Blockbuster to being overtaken by Netflix was was Netflix going to a subscription model and getting more and more effective at delivering overnight DVDs, and the Netflix suggestion queue. Remember, you have your queue of movies, and they would suggest movies to put in there. Well, Blockbuster's single biggest cost in their cost structure was that the licensing fees they had to pay to the big studios for the biggest movies that year, the blockbuster movies. That's right. 70% of people who went to either Netflix or Blockbuster wanted to watch the hot movie. And
Yep.
those hot movies were that much more expensive for Netflix to procure in DVDs that then they could then overnight to you, or for Blockbuster to procure in tapes or DVDs they could have in their stores. So Netflix had less money than Blockbuster. so so they basically developed this queue that would direct you to the movies that were cheaper for them to acquire because they didn't keep many of the blockbusters around. So we thought Netflix was making them more cultured and doing you a favor. In many ways, the queue was protecting themselves against a weak part of their business model, which was, they couldn't afford to keep tens of thousands of DVDs of the hottest new movie in town. So Blockbuster, when Netflix went from charging by the disc to a subscription model with no late fees and the queue, at that point, it just became so darn convenient and so much of a better value proposition that that Blockbuster crumbled, and then eventually streaming took over, and now Netflix is an entertainment company, right? They're making their own movies, but that was the real key, and the question would have been, could have survived on a subscription model, which would have meant no late fees. I don't know. Often companies that get disrupted by others are doing all the right things. They're listening to their best customers. They're organized around the right stuff, but they get addicted to something. And for Blockbuster, it was you got addicted to the late fees. So it was always pressure to not change your business model in the way Netflix never had that pressure.
Yeah, and Kodak the same, right, with film.
Mm, that's
Yeah,
right.
I mean, who doesn't want digital? Even back then, when digital cameras were starting, you don't have to carry any film, and there's tons of, you could take 1,000 pictures or whatever. So, what did you think went wrong with the strategy with Sears? Because they had like 120-year lead on
Yeah.
Amazon with their catalog, and it was already the most well-known catalog in the world. They already had the warehouses, the logistics, everything was already there for them to be Amazon instead of being bankrupt and disappearing.
Yeah.
What went wrong with this strategy here, and why did it go so wrong? Because I'm sure they hired a bunch of people from Harvard and
Right.
Wharton,
Yeah, right.
uh,
Right.
and they still went wrong.
Right. Well, I would offer that Walmart ultimately killed Sears and Amazon got to dance on the grave. And here's what I mean. So imagine with me a meeting, and something like this could have very well taken place. Early 1980s, you and I are at the Sears and Roebuck board meeting, 100th floor of the Sears Tower back then in
Yeah,
Chicago, right now called the Willis Tower.
yeah,
And I say, as one of the competitive strategist in the room, I say, board, there's this company in Bentonville, Arkansas, that's putting a big retailer in every one traffic light town in America. The kind of places we would never put one of our stores because it doesn't have the demographics and the economics to support a Sears and Roebuck store. And there would be laughter around the room and they say, Bentonville, Arkansas, is that even a place? I had to stand sitting up here in the top of the Sears Tower. We've owned American retailing for over 100 years. Um, and of course, the Walmart strategy to start in all those underserved places allowed them to get a toehold, develop their own unique business model of everyday low prices with ruthlessly efficient logistics, right? If you ever want to see a ballet, go to the back of a Walmart distribution center and watch the loading docks in the middle of the night. I mean, it's unbelievable, right? They're coming in every 2 minutes, incredible organization, right? That allows Walmart just to move product. So Sears gave them an opening by ignoring a certain market. Walmart used that opening to get better and better. It's like when Japanese cars came into the U.S. market in the early 1970s, right? The US car makers were like, what are these crummy little cars down at the low end of the market? They can't even make any money. So the US car makers who are making, big good cars, they refused to chase the new entrants, Toyota and Honda, because they were in the crummy part of the market. They were down market. But it gave them a toehold, allowed them to prove their products, and then boom, Alexis pops up on the screen 20 years later, and now they're really good cars. So the same thing happened with Sears and Walmart. And then could Sears have survived? Walmart hasn't cracked this code either. As a purely online retailer, it was too late. By that point, Amazon was coming the other direction. And as you pointed out, the business that Sears invented and started in eventually got taken over because they never quite got, I still don't think even, I think a much greater percentage of Walmart's revenue and profits now come from their online stuff, but it's still nobody's Amazon. So, there's certain parts of the business that companies take over. Sears got hit from two directions at once. Walmart became a better uh, brick and mortar retailer, and Amazon became a better catalog retailer. And the rest is history. One of the great American companies went down and out forever.
Do you think it's because a lot of the people who rise up in those organizations um, also aren't very creative thinkers, and for a lot of times they're hiring finance people to go up to it, and they're thinking short term. They're not thinking 5, 10 years out about how the world is changing, and they're more worried about the current stock price and the current bonus as opposed to you being an entrepreneur and basically thinking long-term strategy. Because like Mark Zuckerberg makes a $15 billion investment in the metaverse, and even if it's wrong, the thinking was right. To
Right.
look at something and say, let's create a strategy on something I think could be really big, and there are 70 million metaverse users in the world and growing. So why do these companies, how does it go wrong for them? Do you think it's in the selection process of the people they choose, or that they just get arrogant about their position and just think it can't be overtaken?
Well, there's all that, but there's another phenomenon, which is they don't want to put themselves out of business. So you mentioned Kodak. There's a
Yeah.
lot of evidence that Kodak was ahead on digital photography, ahead of everybody
Yeah.
else, right? But it would have meant putting current Kodak out of business to create new Kodak, right? And this is impossible. All the talent, all the best people, all the profits, all the stuff was tied to the old business. And so when is a business willing to cannibalize? Same thing with Sears, same thing with many other things. Are you willing to put yourself out of business by getting to a different future ahead of the competition? Intellectually, people understand this formula. The work by, say, like Clayton Christensen, the
Yeah.
former Harvard Business School professor on disruptive innovation, is example after example after example of this. But the human ability, even when understanding it intellectually, to viscerally enact the thing that will put your amazing, terrific, brilliant, bill-paying current business out of business in order to get to a potentially different future, which is uncertain. This is beyond people. It's beyond the scope of most human endurance in organizations. So they don't do it. So they do all the right things. They listen to the best customers. They invest in their best businesses. They live for today, as you pointed out, and then ultimately the future usually overtakes them.
Would you advise CEOs of these kinds of companies, if you're on the board, because you serve on the board,
Mm,
saying maybe we should just spin off a competitor to us, so we're playing both horses here as opposed to just the one horse? Because we know intellectually that somebody's going to go do this.
right,
It might
right,
as
right.
well be us. And if we can't beat ourselves here, at least we still will survive, and maybe we become even bigger and stronger based on this. But if I'm not going to play this and I let the competitor know that they're going to cannibalize my business, the my long-term strategy is I'm knowing I'm going to lose. So what would you say if you're on the board of these companies?
Yeah, and I do think that's possible good strategy for people who are sensing that there's some disruptive innovation that could happen to them. But I think the key is you got to do it totally separately.
Yeah,
You
that's what I
got to
mean. Yeah,
genuinely, they got to go off to a different place. They've got to maybe change a
exactly.
name. Yeah. Yeah. And probably the only connectivity is at what I'll call the shareholder level, that the shareholders still are vested in both enterprises.
Right.
So that there's not what I'll call a loss as power potentially shifts from the old to the new.
Yeah, I mean, look, GE is not anything like it used to be, but now they're three public companies splitting out because I guess the long-term strategy was together we don't make a lot of sense, but separately there not only can be survived, but maybe all three of us end up thriving here, right? At the
I
end
think
of the
there's more
day.
of that coming. I think there's more divestment from the old conglomerates that's coming ahead of us. I sense that.
And chapter 3 discusses the limitations of two-dimensional strategic positioning map. In practice, how do you recommend companies prioritize which dimensions to include in their maps to ensure they capture the most relevant aspects of their competitive landscape? And what strategies can they use to overcome the inherent limitations of representing complex market dynamics in a simplified visual format?
So I always say start with if you want to know how to think about yourself and your competitive positioning, and you want to be able to map that, where do you sit in the market versus your competitors? Go ask your customers, why do you pick us? If the answer you get back is because you add great value, we're price sensitive and you meet our price point, then you should definitely have as one of your axes in how you map your world price, because you live in a certain part of that world, right? If they say, we don't care about price. For us, it's 100% about service delivery and reliability on the back end after your product or service has been delivered, then you should, map customer relationship management and long-term customer relations. If they say, look, we really don't care, just show up with the coolest thing and go away, right? We just want innovation. We want incredible. We want to be on the cutting edge. We want new stuff. We want design. We want functionality, all that. Then you should have, innovation and differentiated design on your axis, and then map yourself in that feature that the customers told you is important to them against everybody else, and so on. And in fact, I have a good diagram in one of the chapters there of a kind of a business model canvas where I look at the
Yep.
in two businesses competing against you, the New York Stock Exchange or a stock exchange against a more innovative capital markets trading firm. And like, well, what are the seven things customers who come to stock exchanges want? And how important are they to them? And how are we different? And that's another way to map your thing. So I always say just start with your customer. They'll tell you what's important to them about why they choose you or somebody else. And then you could decide on the features that you want to map yourself against where the customers are and where you may sit differently than others in the market.
Question here is while the pastel framework, and that's political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal, um, framework is presented to identify broad trends shaping the marketplace. It can be challenging to translate these trends into actionable strategic insights. Could
Mm,
you share an example of how a company might use the pastel framework to not only identify relevant trends, but also to develop specific strategies to capitalize on opportunities or mitigate threats arising from those trends?
right. Well, when I work and I use the pestle framework to help people sort out how their environment is changing around them, I make people do a whiteboard drill where they're only allowed to put precise, verifiable statements about how it affected them. So you can't say the new political environment has led to uh, um, unpredictability about ongoing business investment. Okay, great. I read that too. It was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Uh, what's a precise, verifiable statement for how it affects you? I'll give you an example. I was out last week talking to a manufacturing and industrial conference in Ohio, and there are people in there that are, really do right. They bend metal, right? There's boilermakers and things like that. They really make large scale industrial equipment. And so I said to them, they said, well, this new economic environment is very much going to affect us. And I said, okay, it's going to affect everybody. So what? How does it really affect you? And I made them go in teams and sort it out. And they were like, oh gosh, well, you know, this particular part of our supply chain is going to be that much more expensive or less accessible. Um, this. So then the answer to that, if that's a problem, it's a precise, verifiable statement of a problem that will affect you directly, and you can actually see when the impact will happen. How do you develop mitigating strategies? Or like, okay, we need to have an alternative supply chain outside of one. In this case, that would be hit by tariffs because that part of the supply chain was coming from overseas. And so we went around the room, right? So there's a technological trend. I mean, Netflix, so these can also be opportunities too, right? That'd be exciting. As the technology started maturing, in the mid 2000s, 2006, 7 time frame, and it allowed for streaming, right? Netflix says, well, let's become streaming. So a bunch of guys sitting in a warehouse in Sacramento, California, running a logistics business whose expertise was mailing DVDs and getting them back quickly, who had hired the Postmaster General of the United States to be their COO, because that's the kind of business they are. They're in the post office business. They said, we need to become a technology services provider. Why? Because the technology has changed. The T in pestle has changed such that it will allow anybody to deliver the content we now mail to people on a DVD, deliver it to them directly over the thing. But they needed that technological moment to happen for it to be available. And they kind of got there first on it, even though they weren't a technology company. And ironically, they were using Amazon's pipes to do it. And Amazon Prime would have to follow them later as a competitor. So it's simply a matter of reducing it down to what does it mean for you? And I like this drill of I want precise, verifiable statements of what this means for you. And then we can talk about how to mitigate against the impact or exploit the opportunity.
In chapter 4, you emphasize the importance of identifying a true sustainable core competency, something valuable, rare, difficult to imitate, and hard to substitute for businesses in highly commoditized industries. What practical steps can leaders take to genuinely uncover such core competencies rather than confusing market positioning or temporary advantages for sustainable roots? And do you have any examples of people who've done this right?
Yeah, no, and I use a couple of examples in the book. I mentioned the Whole Foods one, where
Yeah.
if you dig underneath what's special, Whole Foods' secret weapon, it's not the stuff you see on the shelves. It's how a small percentage of the stuff you see on the shelves got there. Here's another example, though, and you hit it in the way you frame the question mark because it's usually the roots. Right. A lot of companies fool themselves. They believe their own marketing material. We're the leading provider, but I'm like, oh, that's wonderful marketing. So what does it mean to be leading? How do you know it when you see it? Right? How do you keep score on leading? Let's dig deeper. And it's usually not in the products or services. It's usually in some capacity underneath. So, I mentioned Pixar. So for Pixar, it was the IP and the unique CGI they had developed over 10 years, which Steve Jobs maintained at the time would be impossible for a company to copy unless they took years and years to do it. It wasn't the actual films themselves, which we all remember. It was this unique CGI tool underneath. So I'll give you another example. Trader Joe's. Trader Joe's, the supermarket, a lot of people have been in it. You know,
Yep.
uh, 80% of Trader Joe's profits, last time I looked at the data, come from and the majority of their products in the store comes from dry packaged goods and frozen goods with with whom they have a private label arrangement with a third party supplier, often unknown. And so that private label Trader Joe's stuff, but they're the opposite of right. They don't spend time and money to have the best fresh produce because they have very little of it. They have just enough in the store so you don't have to make a second trip to another store to get a banana, right? But all their money's being made on the private label Trader Joe's, right? It's the same thing at Costco, the Kirkland brand stuff,
Yeah.
right? And their ability to conclude those agreements, private label agreements with suppliers. They could be big suppliers. I mean, those Kirkland pretzels could be Snyder's of Hanover pretzels, but
Yeah.
they're labeled Kirkland, right? And it's in right. So that's their secret sauce. That's their core competency underneath. Apple's core competency, they want you to tell you it's designed for the iPhone, but you know what it is? It's the supply chain. It's their ability to have an extraordinary and profitable supply chain, which is why they backed off, the potential for tariffs for phones so quickly. I think someone just showed the White House the data of where all Apple's profits come from, and they're like, "Oh, the cow, right? We don't want to hurt that." That's one of the biggest stocks in the market, with the biggest, broadest investment pool, one of the most successful American companies. Don't kill it, because their secret sauce is the supply chain and the margins and efficiency within it, as opposed to whatever you think you see when you hold your iPhone. So this is a really important area, and most companies can be fundamentally dishonest about it because they don't want to dig deep underneath. And I have a series of drills, some of which are in the book, that help companies get to this realization of what are you actually really good at that other people aren't.
Yeah. What do you think whole strategy was when they were down to the point that Steve Jobs had to convince Bill Gates, give me 150 million or
Mm.
the government's going to break you up. So this is what kind of strategy do you think he had, not to convince Bill Gates, but how to turn a company around that looked like it was absolutely going under?
Yeah, when Steve Jobs came back the second time, I think they had about 2 months of cash left to make payroll,
Right.
right? And he famously said, they said, "What's your strategy to turn around?" He said, "We're gonna wait for the big new thing." But I think he was just being Steve Jobs, the mystic. He was
Yeah.
playing that role. Well, the genius turned out to be the Apple ecosystem that saved them. So, for instance, when the iPod came on the market, there were 70 other MP3 players already out there. It was a mature technology. There was nothing innovative about that. What was innovative about the iPod was you could connect it to the iTunes store, in which you could buy your music and upload it easily. I remember I had an MP3 player from a company called Charles River. It was an engineering marvel, but it was like 9 steps for me to put music on it. I'd have to buy it in different sites and download it and put it in different files and all this other stuff. And Apple, like, whoa, everything connects, one ecosystem, it all connects. And the iTunes store turned out to be the thing that saved. And then iPod, and then same thing with the iPhone. The App Store is what. Otherwise, that it's just a smartphone. There were other smartphones out, but the App Store and the ability to have developers who are not Apple employees who can put anything on the phone that they want. And Apple, of course, that's been a contentious relationship with developers and Apple over the years about that, but they figured that out. So that turned out to be the things that saved Apple. People look at Macs like, oh, that's the most beautiful laptop ever, that MacBook. Well, MacBook, I don't think has ever gotten above 7 or 8% in the market, in the laptop market, right? This is not a rule the world product. Why does Apple rule the world? It was because of that connectivity, first with the iPod, then with the iPhone, between all these different ecosystems, not the device itself.
Yeah, I remember I bought a Microsoft had Zune, and that was a better product than Apple had. And yet it didn't have the cool that Apple's products have for the
Mm,
person's different. Because Steve Jobs had cool and Bill Gates didn't. And a lot of people, copied Steve Jobs' sense of style, right?
that's right.
Uh, in chapter 5, you talk about Steve Jobs, and the team grapple with whether to pursue economies of scale in a new market or economies of scope with their current customers. But frameworks are presented as guides rather than formulaic answers. What advice do you have for leaders when their strategic analysis produces several appealing but divergent growth paths?
Yeah, and I think that's always a challenge, which is we could go a lot of different directions. Um, so I like, if you have the time and space to experiment. And I'm for quickly reinforcing what works and quickly dropping what doesn't. So, if you have the possibility to, um, uh, you know, take advantage of economies of scale, I'm going to sell the exact same thing to more people, right? You can test that. You can test that and model it. If it's economies of scope, which is I'm going to add more stuff and charge more to the product or service I have and sell it to the exact same people, it's all testable. So maybe you want to do it, and then you got to set it up against the resources. Like, do I have the resources to do either? Because both require investment and time. So I encourage companies, look at your resource, look at the art of the possible, look at your talent, and then experiment. launch some pilots, see what you go, and then reinforce success and drop what's not working. And I think that's the best advice you get. The only other advice we could ever be honest is it depends, right? You have to really dig down into the unique circumstances of organizations and say, well, let's work through this together. But as a starting place, try multiple courses of action if you have the resources to do it. A lot of small companies don't. They just got to take a bet. And then make a quick decision about reinforcing and moving in a certain direction.
Would you be advising the new CEO of Intel? I mean, they had a huge strategic advantage, not to mention one of the most trusted brands on the planet.
Right.
And now they're kind of like an afterthought that's struggling, even though they're a 45 billion or $50 billion company, they're very much a struggling $50 billion company. So if you're sitting on the board and you're advising the new CEO, what should they be looking at in terms of strategy and how should they be thinking about it?
Right. So they have a couple of choices. One of them would to be the next NVIDIA, but NVIDIA is already the next NVIDIA.
Yeah, right.
Right. Intel was the next NVIDIA 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Um, so what could they be? So in other words, I'm gonna maybe not invest and now out innovate the most innovative company in the space, right? So then I may say, you know what? This chips business is also a heavily politicized environment because of the geopolitics around it and the fact that Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation makes 85% of the advanced chips in the world. And that's a very dynamic, even dangerous geopolitical environment out there right now, right? Well, and Intel has already benefited from this. Let me let me be part of a solution that helps with that supply chain dependency that worries American and European consumers. Okay. And Intel's already taken advantage of this somewhat by taking advantage of the CHIPS Act and the subsidies from the government to build new plants. But you just say, I'm gonna be your onshore TMSC, right? Your TSMC. I'm going to be your onshore TSMC. So don't try to out innovate NVIDIA, but instead be more politically safe bet for TSMC. The other thing I think they could do is say, sort of like DeepSeek did with jumping ahead a phase in an eye, is get to the next phase of the value proposition people get from advanced microchips without making the microchips, right? Are the things that, and sometimes companies that manufacture stuff confuse what they're making with the value the customer gets from what they're making. And that's a big theme in one of the chapters in the book, which is know the value you're providing to the paying customer. Don't get obsessed with your own product. So Hilti Tools, a Swiss tool manufacturer for construction work, that's the issue. They realized as they were selling tools to construction sites and construction managers, they realized that what the construction manager, what their customer wanted was the use of the tool, not the tool itself. So that caused them to change their whole business model to a equipment fleet leasing model rather than selling tools on site. And it changed their whole business. So what is the value customers want from chips versus the chip itself? That may provide some insights for different directions Intel could go.
I can't believe the hour went past so fast. And I have to tell
Mm.
you, I wish I was taking your class and you were my professor, because you
Likewise.
wrote a great book and you have an amazing background, which gives you so much credibility with your students, I'm sure. So I
Mm.
thank you for taking the time to speak with us again. It's a wonderful book, and I'm hoping you'll write additional books.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Great to be here. And thanks for doing what you're doing with this show.
Thank you.